The man history remembers as Richard Milhous Nixon didn't start with much. He was born on January 9, 1913, in a tiny farmhouse in Yorba Linda, California. Just a patch of land, a dirt road, and a dream that didn't come easy. His parents were Quakers, poor, disciplined, and stubbornly devout. His father ran a gas station. His mother barely smiled. Nixon grew up knowing two things: hard work and how fast the world could turn cold. He wasn't the oldest, he wasn't the favorite, but he learned early that if he couldn't charm a room, he could outwork it. While other kids played, Richard kept his head down, always listening, always watching, always calculating, and underneath that quiet face was something the world hadn't seen yet: a will to rise no matter the cost. Tragedy hit the family hard. Two of his brothers died young, one from tuberculosis, the other from a brain hemorrhage. Nixon rarely spoke of them, but those losses left permanent scars, reminders that life was fragile, unfair, and never truly safe. As a teenager, he excelled in school, but rarely found joy in social settings. Even then, it was clear, he was driven by something deeper than popularity. In college, Nixon chose Whittier College over more prestigious East Coast schools, in part because of finances, and in part because he didn't feel like he belonged in elite circles. At Whittier, he helped form a club called the Orthogonians, a group for the hardworking students who weren't invited into the popular Franklin Society. That resentment would define him. Nixon wasn't the kind of man who forgot slights. He carried grudges like they were mission statements, and he saw the world as divided between insiders and outsiders. And he knew exactly which side he was on. Later in life, even as president, he still spoke of the Franklins with bitterness. After college, he briefly worked as an attorney before joining the Navy during World War II. There, he built a reputation as efficient, detail-oriented, and fiercely loyal. Though he never saw combat, he earned respect for his logistics work in the South Pacific. Still, he felt overlooked by the more polished, charismatic officers. He learned to keep his head down, but he was always watching. When the war ended, Nixon didn't go home to comfort. He went into politics. His entry into politics wasn't glamorous. Backed by conservative donors, Nixon ran for Congress in 1946, portraying his opponent as soft on communism. The tactic worked. He won, and learned that fear was a powerful tool. From that moment forward, Nixon would wield patriotism like a sword. He didn't just believe in America. He believed that America was under siege from within, and he would be its defender. That inner fire, the losses, the discipline, the outsider's chip on his shoulder, would never leave him. Nixon was a man shaped by hardship, sharpened by rejection, and powered by a belief that the world was always watching, always judging. He didn't need to be liked. He needed to win. Nixon's rise through the political ranks was swift and calculated. By the late 1940s, he made national headlines during his role in the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, going after alleged communist infiltrators. The most famous of these confrontations was with Alger Hiss, a former State Department official accused of spying. Nixon's aggressive questioning and dogged pursuit of Hiss catapulted him into the national spotlight. To some, he was a patriot defending American values. To others, he was a ruthless, self-serving operator who would say or do anything to get ahead. Either way, he had arrived. His work on HUAC earned him the attention of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who selected Nixon as his running mate for the 1952 presidential election. But Nixon nearly derailed the campaign when he was accused of having a secret political fund, an allegation that, if true, could have cost them the election. With his back against the wall, Nixon went on television and delivered what would become known as the Checkers speech. In it, he denied wrongdoing, defended his integrity, and shared a personal story about his dog, Checkers, gifted to his daughters. The speech was raw, emotional, and direct. Millions of Americans watched, and most were won over. That televised moment revealed Nixon's political instinct. He knew how to play the public. He understood how to twist vulnerability into strength. It was also the first time he leaned into something that would define his presidency. Using the media, not just surviving it. He didn't trust the press, but he knew how to manipulate it. That dance between resentment and reliance would never end. Nixon's aggressive style made him enemies in Washington. Journalists were wary of him, liberals loathed him, and even some within his own party found him too calculating. But he didn't care. His success wasn't built on affection, it was built on utility. If you helped him win, you stayed. If not, you were forgotten. This wasn't politics, it was war. And yet, behind the scenes, Nixon remained deeply self-conscious. He often spoke of feeling misunderstood, of being mocked for his appearance, his voice, his lack of charm. These insecurities weren't just emotional, they were strategic. They fed his belief that the world was out to get him. And in Nixon's world, suspicion was safety. As vice president from 1953 to 1961, Nixon served under the towering figure of Dwight Eisenhower, a military hero beloved by the public. But the relationship between them was often strained. Eisenhower didn't fully trust Nixon and rarely gave him meaningful responsibilities. In key moments, Nixon was sidelined or left to defend policies he didn't shape. Publicly, he stood by Eisenhower. Privately, the cold distance stung. It was a humbling experience for a man who saw himself as destined for the top. Nixon tried to use the role to gain foreign policy credibility. He traveled extensively, visiting Africa, Latin America, and the Soviet Union. One of his most famous moments came in Moscow during the 1959 kitchen debate with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. It was an unscripted exchange about capitalism versus communism, and Nixon held his own. The moment was televised back in the US, painting him as a tough defender of American values. For Nixon, it was a rare moment of spontaneous triumph. But even these moments of success didn't erase the feeling that he was still being underestimated. Eisenhower once told reporters he'd have to think hard about what Nixon had contributed to the administration, a remark that cut deep. Nixon never forgot it. The slight confirmed what he already believed. No matter how hard he worked, he would never be fully accepted by the political establishment. He used the vice presidency as a launch pad. In 1960, Nixon ran for president against a young senator from Massachusetts, John F. Kennedy. The campaign was brutal, and Nixon's insistence on visiting all 50 states left him exhausted and physically drained. The final blow came during the first ever televised presidential debate. Kennedy looked cool and confident. Nixon appeared pale, sweaty, and tired. The visual contrast shaped public perception and cost him the election. Losing to Kennedy was a wound Nixon never recovered from. He believed the media had handed the presidency to someone with better hair and a better smile. That resentment would simmer for years, and it would turn into something darker when Nixon came back for revenge. After the crushing loss in 1960, Nixon returned to California, where he ran for governor in 1962, and lost again. His concession speech was bitter, emotional, and unfiltered. "You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore," he told the press, then walked off. It was a moment of raw humiliation, broadcast live. Most assumed his career was over. But Nixon wasn't finished. He was biding his time. During those years out of power, Nixon nursed every insult. He followed politics obsessively. He made notes about people who had betrayed him. He told allies that he would return, not just to win, but to settle scores. The defeats didn't break him, they refined him. He was done trying to be liked. The next time he stepped onto the political stage, he would play by his own rules. And then the country changed. The Vietnam War escalated. Cities burned with riots. The Cultural Revolution terrified Middle America. Nixon saw his opening. He returned to national politics in 1968, this time with a new message: stability, order, and peace. He didn't run as a moderate, he ran as a protector. He called on the silent majority to take back the country from chaos. The message hit hard. Nixon's 1968 campaign was one of discipline and precision. He avoided the press as much as possible, relying instead on carefully scripted appearances. He used code words, law and order, the forgotten American, states' rights, to signal strength without sounding aggressive. He didn't shout, he whispered. And voters leaned in. On election night, Nixon won the presidency. But something inside him had changed. He hadn't just returned to power, he had returned with a vendetta. The press, the liberals, the bureaucrats, they had mocked him, defeated him, doubted him. Now he would show them all. The Nixon who entered the White House in 1969 was not the same man who had served under Eisenhower. This Nixon was sharper, colder, more guarded. He surrounded himself with loyal aides, men like H.R. Haldeman and John Ehrlichman, who understood that trust was earned and enemies were everywhere. The presidency wasn't just a job, it was a fortress. He focused his early presidency on ending the Vietnam War through a policy he called Vietnamization, slowly pulling out American troops while arming the South Vietnamese. At home, he appealed to voters angry at student protesters and civil rights activists. Nixon promised order, he promised control, and he made Americans feel like someone had their back. Behind the scenes, though, he grew more suspicious by the day. He had the IRS audit political opponents. He demanded loyalty from his staff. He installed taping systems in the White House to record conversations. Paranoia became policy. Nixon wasn't trying to lead the country. He was trying to dominate the forces he believed wanted to destroy him. He also believed he was building a legacy. Foreign policy breakthroughs with China and the Soviet Union gave him international prestige. He saw himself as a statesman, on par with giants of history. But he also saw ghosts. Every time a reporter criticized him, he remembered 1960. Every time someone questioned his decisions, he remembered the Franklins at Whittier. This was the world Nixon created for himself, one where every critic was a threat. Every friend could become a traitor, and every move had to be recorded. He had won. But he didn't feel safe. Not yet. Vietnam, Kent State, and unrest at home. Nixon entered office with a promise to bring peace and order, but the war in Vietnam kept dragging on. American troops were dying, and the public was growing angrier by the week. Protests exploded across college campuses, and by 1970, trust in government had nearly evaporated. That May, at Kent State University, National Guard troops opened fire on unarmed student protesters. 4 students were killed, and the country was stunned. Nixon condemned the violence, but also blamed campus radicals, deepening the divide. In living rooms across America, parents feared their children could be next. The war wasn't just happening overseas, it was tearing the US apart from the inside. Nixon saw these protests as more than disagreement. To him, they were personal attacks, fueled by people who never respected him in the first place. He viewed the media as part of the same problem, twisting facts, stirring chaos, undermining his presidency. With each riot, each angry headline, he grew more suspicious. He believed he was under siege, not just politically, but morally. He began to speak in terms of us versus them. And to Nixon, them was growing every day. The anti-war movement wasn't just noisy, it was effective. Every protest chipped away at the government's credibility. Nixon's speeches about peace with honor rang hollow to young Americans watching footage of burned villages and body bags. As criticism mounted, he stopped trying to win people over. Instead, he appealed to the silent majority, the Americans who didn't protest, didn't shout, but wanted their country back. It was a clever political shift, but it also fueled his isolation. Nixon started trusting fewer and fewer people. Privately, his staff noticed a change. He no longer held open debates and meetings. He preferred loyalty over advice. Even his closest aides, men like Bob Haldeman and John Ehrlichman, saw him retreat into smaller and more guarded circles. Nixon didn't want disagreement. He wanted affirmation. If someone warned him about going too far, they didn't stay in the room for long. This wasn't leadership, it was control. The Vietnam conflict gave Nixon an excuse to tighten that control. He expanded surveillance programs. He gave more power to federal agencies. And quietly, he began laying the groundwork for something darker, a belief that his enemies were everywhere and that they needed to be stopped before they destroyed him. The war might end overseas. But the real battle, he thought, was happening at home. Despite the turmoil, Nixon scored some of the biggest foreign policy victories of the 20th century. In 1969, under his watch, America landed a man on the moon. The image of Neil Armstrong planting the flag was a powerful moment, one that gave Nixon's presidency a rare moment of unity. Though he had little to do with the actual mission, he embraced it as part of his leadership legacy. He called the astronauts from the White House. He praised American greatness. For a moment, even his critics stood still. Then came China. In a move that stunned the world, Nixon visited the People's Republic of China in 1972. It was the first time an American president had stepped foot in the communist nation. The visit was broadcast across the globe. Nixon, the staunch anti-communist, now shook hands with Mao Zedong. It wasn't just diplomacy, it was a masterstroke. It helped shift the global balance of power, cooled tensions, and opened new trade possibilities. Nixon looked like a genius. Next came the Soviet Union. Later that same year, Nixon met with Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev and signed key arms control agreements. The two powers agreed to slow the nuclear arms race through the SALT I Treaty. The press called it détente, a thawing of Cold War hostility. Nixon looked calm, confident, and statesmanlike. He smiled for the cameras, gave speeches about peace, and returned home with high approval ratings. For a time, even Watergate seemed like background noise. But underneath those victories, something was rotting. Nixon didn't feel secure. He didn't trust that success would last. Every handshake, every headline, he believed, could be used against him later. Even in triumph, he feared betrayal. He wondered what the press would twist. He questioned what his enemies were plotting while he smiled for the cameras. Foreign policy had been his shield. It made him look like the grown-up in the room. But the moment the glow faded, the shadows would return. Nixon knew it. And so, even as the world praised him, he was already planning for war. Not abroad, but inside the walls of Washington. In 1971, a former military analyst named Daniel Ellsberg leaked a top-secret report known as the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times. The documents revealed years of government lies about Vietnam, under both Democrats and Republicans. Nixon hadn't created those lies, but he feared their release would damage him anyway. He saw the leak as a national betrayal, but more than that, he saw it as a personal threat. If one man could expose classified documents, what else could leak? Nixon's reaction was swift. He ordered his team to plug the leaks at all costs. That's when he authorized the creation of a secret unit inside the White House, the Special Investigations Unit, better known as the Plumbers. Their job was to stop leaks before they happened. But this wasn't a normal government team. These were Nixon's private operatives, reporting only to his inner circle. Their methods? Break-ins, surveillance, intimidation. They operated in secret, with no oversight. The Plumbers didn't start with Watergate. Their first mission was a break-in at the office of Ellsberg's psychiatrist. They wanted to dig up dirt on him, discredit him, humiliate him, shut him down. The operation was sloppy and illegal, but Nixon approved it. To him, this wasn't abuse of power, it was defense. The country was at war, and enemies had to be neutralized. This moment marked a turning point. The President of the United States had unleashed a team of political spies. He didn't ask Congress. He didn't check with legal advisors. He simply acted. And once that line was crossed, there was no going back. Nixon had built a machine that couldn't be turned off. From the outside, everything looked stable. Inside the White House, paranoia ruled. The plumbers didn't solve problems, they created more. And as Nixon leaned harder on secrecy, the web of lies began to tighten. Watergate wasn't a random event, it was the next logical step in a presidency built on fear. By early 1971, Nixon had become obsessed with control. Not just over his enemies, but over his own staff. He wanted a record of every meeting, every phone call, every conversation in the Oval Office. That's when he ordered a secret taping system to be installed throughout the White House. The goal? Create a permanent archive of everything. He didn't tell most of his staff, only a handful knew. The system was voice-activated. Whenever someone spoke near a phone or a desk in key locations, the tape would roll automatically. It captured arguments, agreements, jokes, threats. Every word. Nixon believed this would protect him. He could review conversations later, catch contradictions, defend himself if needed. It was his private truth vault. But that vault came with danger. Nixon assumed the tapes were safe, hidden from the world. He never imagined they'd one day be used against him. He never thought the words he recorded would become his undoing. He believed the presidency was his shield, but the microphone doesn't lie. At the time, no one questioned the taping system. Staffers focused on daily battles. Reporters didn't know it existed. Even cabinet members had no clue they were being recorded. Nixon had built the perfect trap and stepped into it himself. It was like sealing a confession into a vault and locking it with his own hand. The irony is brutal. The tapes were supposed to give Nixon power, but eventually they gave the country proof. Not yet, but the clock had started ticking. Nixon kept lists, real ones, typed, circulated, and updated by his aides. These were people he considered enemies, politicians, journalists, donors, entertainers. Their crimes ranged from criticizing him on TV to supporting liberal causes. Some names were big, others were obscure, but to Nixon, they were all threats. He didn't just want to beat them, he wanted to hurt them. He used the federal government to do it. The IRS was pressured to audit people on the list. The CIA was asked to monitor domestic groups, despite strict rules against spying on Americans. Nixon's campaign team, known as CREEP, the Committee to Re-elect the President, paid for dirty tricks, forged letters, fake rallies. It was all part of a system: intimidate, confuse, silence. Inside the White House, aides carried out these plans with quiet efficiency. They believed they were protecting the president. They believed the ends justified the means. Nixon didn't need to micromanage every detail. He had built a culture where loyalty mattered more than legality. If something stopped a critic, it was seen as a win. What began as paranoia had become standard procedure. Leaks were treated like treason. Dissent was treated like betrayal. Nixon didn't view these tactics as corrupt. He saw them as necessary. And the longer they worked, the bolder he became. But every abuse left fingerprints. Every dirty trick left someone angry, suspicious, or hurt. Nixon thought he was controlling the chaos. What he didn't realize was that he was creating a trail, one that others would eventually follow, all the way to Watergate. June 17, 1972. 5 burglars caught inside DNC HQ at the Watergate Hotel. It was just after 2 a.m. on a warm summer night in Washington, D.C., when a quiet security guard named Frank Wills noticed something strange. A door in the Watergate office complex had tape over the latch, on the inside, not the outside. He removed the tape and kept walking. But when he came back later and saw it taped again, he called the police. Moments later, officers in plain clothes entered the building, expecting maybe a vandal or trespasser. Instead, they found 5 men crouched inside the Democratic National Committee headquarters. The men wore suits and latex gloves and carried stacks of crisp $100 bills, cameras, wiretaps, and walkie-talkies. These weren't petty criminals. They had high-end equipment, false identification, and hotel keys that linked them to rooms booked under aliases. The burglars included former CIA operatives, anti-Castro militants, and a man named James McCord, who worked as security coordinator for the committee to re-elect the president, better known as CREEP. As the men were arrested, they remained silent. No resistance, no questions, no explanation. For the officers, it was odd. For the Nixon White House, it was the beginning of a slow-burning disaster. News of the break-in hit the press that same day, but it didn't make the front page. It was treated as a strange political blunder, nothing more. Reporters didn't know who the burglars really worked for. No one imagined that a team connected to the president would spy on the opposition. It seemed too sloppy, too risky, too unnecessary. But the pieces were already starting to move, and Nixon's people were already trying to cover their tracks. In the hours following the arrests, calls were made. Lawyers showed up. Bail was arranged quickly. The men said almost nothing to the authorities. Inside the White House, a meeting was held. The first question wasn't, why did this happen? It was, how do we make it go away? Just hours after the arrest, the White House released a short statement. It denied any connection to the break-in and called it a third-rate burglary. That phrase stuck. It was meant to downplay the event, to make it sound like a clumsy, insignificant blip. But to some, it sounded too polished, too fast, too controlled. The timing raised eyebrows. How could they respond so quickly if they had nothing to do with it? Privately, Nixon's aides were already working on a plan. They discussed how to separate the burglars from the campaign and how to limit press coverage. Nixon himself wasn't caught off guard. He was calm, even amused. Who the hell is going to look into a break-in at the Democratic headquarters? He reportedly said. He believed the story would disappear in a few days. He believed wrong. The men who were caught had clear ties to CREAP, the president's campaign machine. But instead of cooperating with investigators, Nixon's team leaned into silence. They instructed staff not to speak to the FBI without clearance. They used the CIA to pressure the Bureau to back off. It wasn't just a denial, it was an effort to bury the story before it had a chance to grow. Nixon believed it could be managed. It had to be. In public, Nixon stayed above it all. He gave no major statements about the arrests. His press secretary, Ron Ziegler, dismissed the incident as unimportant. Behind the scenes, however, Nixon was already discussing fundraising efforts to pay the burglars' legal fees and buy their silence. He believed loyalty could be bought and silence maintained. This was the first crack in the wall. A moment where a leader could have told the truth or chosen the cover-up. Nixon chose silence, and from that moment, the lies began to spread. The more reporters looked into the men arrested, the more alarming the links became. James McCord, one of the burglars, had been hired by CREEP as head of security. Others had connections to G. Gordon Liddy and E. Howard Hunt, both ex-intelligence agents now working with Nixon's campaign and White House staff. It wasn't just a coincidence, it was a chain that, if pulled hard enough, could lead straight back to the Oval Office. CREEP wasn't a typical campaign organization. It raised money aggressively, spent it secretly, and kept few records. It ran ads attacking Democrats, funded dirty tricks, and protected the president's political flank. To Nixon, it was a weapon, and like any weapon, it came with risks. The Watergate burglars had received money that could be traced to CREEP accounts. That was the thread. All it needed was someone willing to tug. The FBI quickly found that some of the burglars carried sequential $100 bills, money tied to CREEP's slush fund. But even then, the story struggled to catch fire. Many in the press weren't interested. The campaign season was heating up, and Nixon's team made sure reporters had other stories to chase. But one paper didn't let go: The Washington Post. And two reporters, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, began to dig deeper. Inside CREEP, panic spread. Liddy and Hunt scrambled to stay hidden. Phone calls were erased, documents were shredded, and a strange new figure appeared. Deep Throat, a secret source with ties to the FBI. began whispering to Woodward late at night in a parking garage. What he told them would change everything. But for now, the pieces were still loose. Creep's connections to the break-in weren't public knowledge yet, but inside Nixon's circle, everyone knew how close the danger was. The men arrested weren't strangers. They were soldiers in a political war Nixon had personally approved. And now, those soldiers were in jail. Despite the break-in and the hidden panic behind closed doors, Nixon's campaign rolled forward like nothing had happened. He was riding high in the polls. The Democrats were divided, the war was winding down, and Nixon's foreign policy winds were fresh in voters' minds. The average American didn't care about a hotel break-in they didn't understand. Nixon's team capitalized on that indifference. The media mostly brushed it aside. Most networks and major papers treated Watergate as a low-priority story. The idea that the president's men had bugged the opposition's headquarters sounded like a conspiracy theory. Nixon, smiling and confident on television, showed no signs of worry. To voters, he looked like a winner, and Americans love a winner. His opponent, George McGovern, couldn't gain traction. In October, Nixon told the press, "People have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I am not a crook." It was a strong soundbite. The crowd loved it, and it worked. On November 7th, 1972, Nixon won re-election in a landslide, carrying 49 out of 50 states. It was one of the largest victories in US history, but behind the scenes, the truth was rotting. The burglars had still said nothing. They'd been promised support, promised protection. Their families received envelopes of cash. They stayed quiet because they were told the White House had their back. But silence has a price, and that price was going up. For the moment, Nixon believed he had beaten the scandal. The press was quiet, the people had spoken, and he had 4 more years in the White House. But history doesn't end in silence. It waits, it builds, and this story was far from over. Woodward and Bernstein's investigation, Washington Post. While most of the media lost interest in the Watergate break-in, 2 young reporters at the Washington Post couldn't let it go. Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein didn't look like heroes. They weren't famous. They weren't senior editors. But something about the burglary felt off. The men arrested weren't ordinary criminals. They had backgrounds in government intelligence and money connected to Nixon's campaign. That raised more questions than answers. From the start, Woodward and Bernstein worked on instinct. They knocked on doors, chased leads, and rechecked every document. Their editors gave them space, but they still had to prove they weren't chasing smoke. Their first breakthroughs came quietly. They discovered that one of the burglars, E. Howard Hunt, had a White House connection. Later, they found that someone inside Creep had approved cash payments to keep the men quiet. The more they investigated, the more the story refused to die. What made their work powerful wasn't the drama, it was the discipline. They didn't write flashy headlines or throw around wild theories. They tracked every dollar, verified every name, and only printed what they could prove. They were often wrong, but they kept digging. They didn't know how deep it went, but they sensed it was big. As Bernstein later said, "We weren't out to get the president. We were just trying to get the truth." Inside the Post newsroom, editors warned them to be careful. Nixon's White House had a reputation for punishing critics. Still, the paper backed them. Editor Ben Bradley believed in their work, and in time, their persistence would start to pull the first threads loose from Nixon's tightly wound story. One of Woodward's most mysterious leads came in the form of whispered meetings in an underground parking garage. The source identified himself only as Deep Throat. His voice was low, his instructions were short, and he never gave them everything. But he confirmed what they suspected. The break-in wasn't a one-time mistake. It was part of something much bigger. "Follow the money," he told them. That line became their compass. From then on, Woodward and Bernstein stopped asking who broke in and started asking who paid for it. Creep's slush fund wasn't just about campaign expenses. It was being used to finance political sabotage, blackmail, and silence. Deep Throat never gave names, but he gave clues, and that was enough to keep the story alive. Every time they met, it felt like peeling back another layer. He told them about secret meetings, cover stories, and pressure on the FBI. The reporters would leave those garages with notes scribbled in code, then spend days verifying what he hinted at. No one knew who he was, not even Bernstein. But Woodward trusted him. He sensed the source was high up, maybe even inside law enforcement. What mattered most was that Deep Throat knew the danger. He warned them to stay quiet, to never call from their home phones, and to always be cautious. He didn't leak for fame. He did it because he believed the White House had crossed a line. And each time he spoke, he pointed the spotlight closer to Nixon's door. Years later, Deep Throat would be revealed as Mark Felt, the FBI's Deputy Associate Director. But at the time, he was just a voice in the dark, urging two young reporters to keep going. And because of him, they did. As the investigation crept forward, Nixon's team tried to lock it down. The 5 burglars were in custody, but they were quiet. That silence didn't come cheap. Nixon's aides funneled thousands of dollars to them. Quiet payments to cover lawyers, living expenses, and family supports. The message was simple: stay loyal and you'll be taken care of. The money came from Creep's secret fund, disguised through middlemen and cash deliveries. John Mitchell, the former Attorney General turned campaign chairman, helped direct the flow. H.R. Haldeman and John Ehrlichman, Nixon's closest aides, knew about it. Even John Dean, White House counsel, was involved in managing who got paid and when. These weren't outsiders. These were the president's top men, using campaign funds to cover up a federal crime. Nixon wasn't just aware of the payments, he encouraged them. Recordings later revealed that he approved efforts to contain the situation through cash. He believed if the burglars stayed loyal, the press would lose interest, and by the time the courts got involved, the election would be over. He didn't see it as criminal, he saw it as practical. The system would protect him, so long as the people in it stayed quiet. But as the payments stacked up, so did the lies. FBI investigators noticed patterns in bank withdrawals. Paper trails led to campaign accounts. Whispers of obstruction began surfacing in legal circles. What Nixon's men thought was damage control now looked like conspiracy. And eventually, someone would talk. The hush money wasn't just a moral failure, it was a legal time bomb. And the ticking had already started. The Watergate burglars went on trial in January 1973. Most pled guilty. They didn't give speeches, they didn't point fingers. But something about their silence struck the judge as wrong. Judge John Sirica didn't believe the story ended with the 5 men in front of him. He believed someone was pulling the strings. And he wanted answers. Sirica became one of the first figures in power to openly challenge the White House's version of events. He read every file, questioned every omission, and made it clear he expected the full truth. When he handed down tough sentences, some called it excessive. But Sirica said he was sending a message. If anyone was protecting higher-ups, they needed to think twice. The courtroom wasn't just about punishment, it was about pressure. Behind closed doors, Sirica offered reduced sentences in exchange for full cooperation. One by one, the defendants began to break. They admitted that higher officials were involved. They described how payments had been arranged, how instructions had been passed through lawyers, and how they were told to stay quiet. The silence began to crumble. Sirica's role changed the course of the investigation. He didn't hold press conferences or give speeches, but his bench became one of the few places where power couldn't hide. The Nixon White House had friends in Congress, allies in the press, and loyalists across Washington. But they didn't have Sirica. His skepticism set the tone for what came next. The country was starting to pay attention, and the walls were closing in. In early 1973, under growing public pressure, the US Senate voted to form a special Watergate committee. The goal was simple: find out what really happened. Led by Senator Sam Ervin of North Carolina, The committee held televised hearings that gripped the nation. For the first time, Americans saw witnesses under oath, telling stories of bribery, surveillance, and political sabotage. It wasn't background noise anymore. It was front and center. The hearings introduced the public to names like John Dean, G. Gordon Liddy, and Jeb Magruder. People who had once operated in secret now had to explain themselves on national television. Some denied everything. Others cracked under pressure. Viewers watched from their homes, stunned at how deep the scandal had grown. The White House denied wrongdoing, but the testimony told a different story. The committee didn't just expose crimes, it exposed the culture inside Nixon's White House. A place where loyalty mattered more than truth. A place where the president's power was used to settle scores, silence critics, and bury evidence. Senator Ervin, with his thick accent and deep sense of justice, became a voice of reason. He asked questions calmly, but he asked them relentlessly. Each new witness added to the puzzle. Each document read aloud filled in another gap, and with every session, more Americans began to doubt the president they had just re-elected. The hearings ran for months. They made headlines, led nightly news broadcasts, and sparked debates across dinner tables nationwide. The Senate committee didn't finish the job, but it lit the fuse. What came next would change everything. On June 25, 1973, former White House counsel John Dean took his seat in front of the Senate committee. What he said over the next several days was unlike anything heard before. Calmly and in great detail, Dean outlined the entire cover-up. He named names, he gave dates, and he made it clear that the president knew. There is a cancer on the presidency, he said, and if the cancer is not removed, the president himself will be killed by it. The phrase echoed across the country. It wasn't just poetic, it was precise. Dean described how Nixon had approved hush money, obstructed the FBI, and used the CIA to block investigations. He didn't say it to shock, he said it because it was true. Dean had once been a loyal foot soldier. He believed in the mission. But he saw where it was headed and chose to step out before it consumed him. His decision to testify made him a target. Nixon's allies called him a liar, a traitor, a man looking to save himself. But the details in his testimony were too specific to ignore, and soon others began confirming them. Dean's words cracked the White House's defense wide open. It was no longer just about aides and operatives. It was about Nixon. For the first time, the scandal reached into the Oval Office with force. The press seized on every line. The public felt the ground shift. And Nixon? He stayed silent, watching as the truth crept closer. Dean's testimony wasn't the end, but it was the point of no return. The cancer wasn't just growing, it had already spread. Alexander Butterfield's bombshell. Nixon recorded everything. On July 13, 1973, a quiet, procedural hearing turned explosive when a staff aide named Alexander Butterfield let something slip. He hadn't come to expose anyone. He was just there to explain how the White House worked. But when asked if conversations inside the Oval Office were recorded, he paused. His face tightened, and then he said yes. Every conversation, every word, every room Nixon walked into had been wired. The system was installed secretly in early 1971, activated by voice. No one outside a small circle knew about it. Butterfield, a former Air Force officer, had helped oversee its function. Nixon never told cabinet members or guests they were being taped. There were no beeps, no blinking lights. Just silence and magnetic reels quietly spinning in the background. The microphones were in desks, lamps, and telephones, hidden but always listening. News of the taping system sent shockwaves through Washington. If it was true, then every major conversation about Watergate could be sitting on tape, waiting. Nixon hadn't just overseen the presidency, he had built an archive of it, one that now threatened to undo him. The media jumped on the story instantly. Editorials questioned why a president would need to record every word. And behind the scenes, senators began preparing subpoenas. The stakes had just multiplied. Inside the White House, panic rippled through the staff. Advisors who thought their secrets were safe now realized their voices had been preserved. Some urged Nixon to destroy the tapes immediately. Others worried that erasing them would look like guilt. Nixon did neither. He held on to the recordings, confident he could resist legal pressure. It was a gamble, and he had no room for error. For the first time, the scandal had a hard, physical center. This wasn't rumor, it wasn't testimony. It was audio, recorded in Nixon's own voice. If the tapes confirmed what others had claimed, the president could be exposed beyond spin or defense. And if he resisted turning them over, the country could face a full-blown constitutional crisis. Either way, Nixon's grip on power had started to slip. The Senate Watergate committee demanded access to the tapes. Nixon refused. He cited executive privilege, claiming presidents needed privacy to govern effectively. But that explanation didn't sit well with the public. If the tapes were harmless, why not release them? Nixon's legal team offered transcripts instead, edited summaries, but the Senate rejected them. So did Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox. They wanted the originals. The case quickly escalated. It moved through the lower courts and landed before the U.S. Supreme Court in United States v. Nixon. Nixon's argument was sweeping, that presidents could keep internal discussions confidential no matter what. But the justices weren't convinced. Even presidents, they said, must obey subpoenas during criminal investigations. The ruling came down on July 24, 1974, a unanimous 8-0 decision. Nixon was ordered to hand over the tapes. The decision was historic. It wasn't just about Nixon anymore. It was about how far executive power could stretch. The court's message was clear. No one, not even the president, is above the law. Nixon had run out of legal cover. He had delayed, stonewalled, and dodged. Now, there were no more excuses. He had to comply. Inside the White House, the mood darkened. Legal advisors warned the president that the end was near. Some believed the tapes would be survivable. Others, like James Street Clair, Nixon's attorney, feared they would be devastating. The tapes had become more than evidence. They were now symbols of truth, trust, and betrayal. The president's voice, once seen as strength, could soon become his downfall. Outside, the public waited. The press circled, and Nixon, usually eager to speak to the country, said almost nothing. Behind closed doors, he brooded and made plans. But even he knew, once the tapes were turned over, his presidency might not survive the fallout. All that remained was to hear what was on them. Long before the Supreme Court forced Nixon's hand, he had tried to shut the investigation down another way. In October 1973, he ordered Attorney General Elliot Richardson to fire Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox. Richardson refused. He had promised Congress he wouldn't interfere. So he resigned instead. Next in line, Deputy Attorney General William Ruckelshaus also refused, and also resigned. That left one man, Solicitor General Robert Bork. Bork carried out Nixon's order. He fired Cox. The move shocked the country. 3 senior officials gone in a single night. It felt like something out of a dictatorship. The press dubbed it the Saturday Night Massacre. Nixon claimed he was protecting the office of the presidency. But no one believed that. It looked like a desperate attempt to keep the tapes buried. Public outrage exploded overnight. Protesters flooded the streets. Phone lines in Congress were overwhelmed. People demanded answers, and many demanded Nixon's resignation. The House began considering articles of impeachment. The media ramped up coverage. Nixon's approval rating plunged. Allies began to distance themselves. Even Republicans who had once defended him were silent. In the chaos, Nixon tried to stabilize the situation. He appointed a new special prosecutor, Leon Jaworski. Jaworski was quiet, methodical, and absolutely determined. Unlike Cox, he didn't give interviews, but he did something more dangerous. He subpoenaed the tapes again. The investigation was back on track, and now the cover-up was in plain view. The Saturday Night Massacre didn't just damage Nixon's credibility, it revealed his fear. He had tried to shut down the very process meant to protect justice. And in doing so, he made the case for his own removal stronger. From that point forward, the tide had truly turned. After the court ruling, Nixon finally surrendered several of the requested tapes. But what investigators received wasn't the clean, complete evidence they'd expected. Some recordings were muffled, others were incomplete. One had an unexplained 18.5-minute gap, a section that covered a key meeting just days after the Watergate break-in. Nixon's secretary, Rosemary Woods, claimed she had accidentally erased it. She even demonstrated how she might have done it by stretching awkwardly across her desk. But the explanation didn't hold up. Audio experts said the gap had multiple erasures. It wasn't one long accidental deletion. It had been stopped, started, and overwritten several times. It looked deliberate. Nixon's team said it was a technical issue. But for most people watching, it smelled like cover-up. The missing content felt worse than a confession. It was a void filled with suspicion. Other tapes were heavily edited. Some conversations were chopped mid-sentence. Others were redacted or missing context. Nixon's lawyers insisted the edits were necessary to protect national security. But critics argued the real reason was to protect Nixon himself. Journalists pored over transcripts. Lawmakers raised eyebrows. The gap, they said, wasn't just on tape. It was between what Nixon promised and what he delivered. The public reaction was swift. Polls showed trust in Nixon collapsing even further. People weren't just frustrated, they felt insulted. The president had promised transparency. Instead, he handed them silence. He expected Americans to believe erasure was an accident. But the country had already stopped buying excuses. The damage was done. What should have been a moment of clarity turned into another cloud of doubt. The tapes were supposed to reveal the truth. Instead, they deepened the mystery. And with every edited second, Nixon's credibility crumbled further. The clock was ticking, and now it was loud enough for everyone to hear. Then came the tape from June 23, 1972. It captured a conversation between Nixon and Chief of Staff H.R. Haldeman. The topic? Stopping the FBI from investigating the break-in. Nixon suggested using the CIA to pressure the Bureau. His words weren't vague, they were direct. He wanted to stop the investigation for political reasons. He called it dangerous to keep digging, and he wanted it ended fast. This wasn't speculation. It wasn't secondhand testimony. It was the president himself, calmly discussing how to derail a federal probe. When the tape was released, it became known as the smoking gun. Up to that point, Nixon had denied any involvement in the cover-up. He claimed he didn't know about it until months later. But this recording proved otherwise. He knew, and he acted. The reaction in Congress was immediate. Republican leaders who had defended Nixon for over a year changed course. Senior senators visited the White House and told him the truth. He had lost their support. The House Judiciary Committee already had articles of impeachment ready. If Nixon stayed, he would be the first president removed from office by force. The path forward was clear. Inside the West Wing, the atmosphere was grim. Staff began clearing out their offices. Advisors who once sat close to power now packed boxes in silence. Nixon watched the collapse unfold in real time. He reviewed the tape. He knew the words were damning. There was no way to spin it now. The voice on that tape wasn't distorted or confused. It was him. Even Nixon's staunchest allies knew it was over. The tape didn't just confirm wrongdoing. It destroyed the last thread of doubt. It turned the scandal into a verdict. And it left Nixon with one final option: walk away or be thrown out. For months, Nixon had counted on party loyalty to keep him afloat. Even as the scandal grew, Republicans stuck by him, hoping the evidence would fall short. But the smoking gun tape changed everything. Senator Barry Goldwater, one of the most respected conservatives in the country, paid Nixon a visit. He didn't come with advice. He came with the truth. The Senate no longer had his back. Goldwater was blunt. Nixon didn't have the votes to survive. If he went to trial, he would lose. Other Republican leaders echoed the message. Quietly, they encouraged him to consider resignation. They knew the longer he stayed, the more damage would be done. To the presidency, to the party, to the country. Nixon listened, but didn't respond right away. His family begged him to hold on. Aides urged him to fight. But Nixon saw the numbers. He saw the polls. He saw the faces of his staff as they walked out one by one. He understood that there was no speech, no statement, no strategy that could undo the tape. It was too clear, too real. The damage wasn't political anymore. It was personal. On August 8, 1974, Nixon addressed the nation from the Oval Office. He didn't admit guilt. He didn't apologize. But he said he would resign for the good of the country. The next day, he boarded a helicopter on the White House lawn. He raised his hands in a defiant farewell. And then he flew away, leaving behind a nation still reeling. Nixon's fall wasn't caused by one decision, one lie, or one mistake. It was a long, slow collapse driven by fear, secrecy, and a belief that power could protect him from consequence. In the end, it was his own voice that proved otherwise. And the tapes, meant to preserve history, became the very thing that wrote his final chapter. August 8, 1974, Nixon resigns in a nationally televised address. The night was quiet in Washington, but every screen in America was tuned in. At exactly 9 p.m. on August 8, 1974, President Richard Nixon sat behind a desk in the Oval Office. A flag stood behind him, and his hands were folded. The man who had once held the world's most powerful office was about to give it up. "Good evening," he began. "This is the 37th time I have spoken to you from this office." Everyone knew what was coming, but hearing it felt different. He didn't cry. He didn't break down, but his voice wavered. "I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow." In homes, bars, and apartment buildings, people stared at the screen, some in silence, some in disbelief, a few in tears. Nixon framed it as a decision made for the good of the country. "I no longer have a strong enough political base in the Congress," he said. But the truth was clearer than ever. The presidency had collapsed under the weight of its own secrets. There was no direct apology, no admission of guilt, just a man trying to preserve whatever image he had left. Nixon thanked his supporters, praised his family, and spoke about the pain of leaving early. Then he nodded, the screen faded, and the room behind him went dark. It was a resignation, yes, but it also felt like a confession in code. The image of Nixon at that desk became etched in American memory, a fall captured on live television. The next morning, August 9th, Nixon gave one final farewell to the White House staff. He stood in the East Room with his family beside him. His voice cracked as he spoke about his mother and father. For a brief moment, the mask dropped. The politician became a son, a husband, a man defeated. Then he walked outside, gave a final salute, and boarded Marine One. From the sky, he waved with both arms, smiling but no longer in power. That image, arms up, helicopter rising, is now history. It was the last time a president would leave office without finishing his term. It marked the end of a long, painful chapter. Nixon had survived wars, enemies, and scandal before. But this time, the truth had followed him all the way to the end. And there was nowhere left to hide. Just a month later, on September 8, 1974, newly sworn-in President Gerald Ford sat down behind the same desk. He faced the same cameras. But what he said shocked the country. "I grant a full, free, and absolute pardon unto Richard Nixon." In a single sentence, Ford erased the possibility of prosecution. Nixon would not face charges. He would not stand trial. The case, as far as the government was concerned, was over. Americans were stunned. They had waited for justice. Many believed Nixon needed to be held accountable in court. Now, that moment would never come. Ford said the country needed healing, not more division. He believed a trial would drag on and damage the presidency further. but critics saw something else. A deal made in secret. A favor returned. The outcry was immediate and fierce. Approval ratings for Ford dropped overnight. Protesters lined the streets outside the White House. Letters poured in, some supportive, but many angry. "You robbed the country of closure," one woman wrote. Congress held hearings to determine if a secret agreement had been made before Nixon resigned. No evidence surfaced, but the damage had been done. The new president's image was stained by the old one. Ford defended the decision with calm resolve. He insisted it was the right call, no matter how unpopular, and history has debated him ever since. Some see the pardon as mercy. Others see it as betrayal. What no one disputes is its impact. It divided the nation. It deepened mistrust. And it became a wound that took years to close. For Nixon, the pardon was a lifeline. He escaped prosecution, but not judgment. The courts had to let him go, but the public had already decided. And for millions, the real punishment had already been delivered. Through shame, through history, and through the truth now carved into the national memory. In the months that followed, a new emotion took root in American life: cynicism. Before Watergate, most Americans believed their leaders, even when they didn't agree with them. But after 2 years of lies, cover-ups, and contradictions, something broke. Trust in government dropped to historic lows, and the damage wasn't limited to Nixon. It spread to the entire system. Young people grew skeptical. They questioned everything: politics, institutions, authority. News anchors no longer ended broadcasts with patriotic flair. Instead, they asked hard questions. Politicians who once promised transparency now faced crowds demanding proof. There were hearings, laws, and apologies. But none of it fully repaired the damage. Once trust is lost, it doesn't return easily. Watergate changed how Americans saw power. Presidents were no longer untouchable. The Oval Office no longer carried an automatic assumption of honor. Every decision, every statement, every press release was now met with scrutiny. That shift didn't happen overnight, but it stuck. It reshaped journalism. It redefined accountability. And it changed what the public expected from its leaders. For many Americans, Watergate wasn't just a scandal. It was a betrayal. They had voted, they had believed, and they had been lied to. Not once, but again and again. When the truth finally came out, it didn't restore faith. It confirmed fears. The damage was emotional, not just political. It touched homes, classrooms, pulpits, and street corners. Even decades later, surveys show that Watergate remains one of the defining moments in American distrust. It opened a gap between citizens and institutions, one that politics still struggles to close. The word Watergate became shorthand, not just for corruption, but for a loss of innocence, and that loss still echoes. Out of the wreckage came reform. Congress, under public pressure, passed a wave of new laws designed to prevent another Watergate. Campaign finance rules were tightened. Donations were capped. Political money had to be tracked, disclosed, and reported publicly. The Federal Election Commission, FEC, was created to oversee everything. For the first time, the flow of money into politics had legal guardrails. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. New ethics laws followed. Government employees were now subject to tighter oversight. Rules about conflicts of interest were clarified. The idea was simple. If power could be abused, it had to be restrained. The post-Watergate era didn't assume presidents would act honorably. It assumed they might not. And it built systems around that assumption. Some called it cynical. Others called it realistic. But either way, it was necessary. Perhaps the most important reform was the independent counsel law. It created a system where outside prosecutors, free from White House control, could investigate federal crimes involving the executive branch. No more firing your own investigator, no more calling it a third-rate burglary. It was a guardrail designed with Nixon in mind, and it would shape presidential accountability for years to come. The press, too, changed. Watergate gave birth to a new era of investigative journalism. Reporters became watchdogs, not just messengers. Editors gave more resources to digging, not just reporting. Newsrooms became more aggressive, less trusting, and more determined to expose what others tried to hide. Journalism won Pulitzers, but it also faced backlash. Trust in the media dropped too. But for many, Watergate proved that the press could still uncover the truth. The reforms were necessary, but they weren't foolproof. In time, many were weakened, repealed, or worked around. New scandals emerged. New forms of corruption surfaced. But the Watergate reforms gave future generations a blueprint, a reminder, a warning. They were born from a time when democracy almost cracked and survived. After leaving the White House, Richard Nixon disappeared from public view. He returned to San Clemente, California, where he lived in seclusion. For weeks, he avoided reporters, refused interviews, and kept a tight circle. But over time, he re-emerged. Slowly, cautiously, and with a plan. Nixon didn't want to be remembered for Watergate. He wanted to rebuild something. Even if he couldn't restore the presidency, he wanted to restore his place in history. In the late 1970s and 80s, Nixon published a series of books, most focused on foreign policy, Cold War strategy, and world affairs. He framed himself as a statesman, someone who still had value, insight, and influence. World leaders, including those from China and Russia, still met with him privately. In Washington, he remained controversial, but abroad, he was sometimes welcomed as an elder voice. The man who had opened China still had weight. Then came the interviews. In 1977, he sat down with David Frost for a televised series watched by millions. For the first time, he spoke openly about Watergate. He admitted to mistakes, but avoided full responsibility. At one point, he famously said, "When the president does it, that means it's not illegal." The line was chilling, and it reminded everyone why Watergate still mattered. But the interview was a success. Frost challenged him, and Nixon, at times, looked human. Through the 1980s, Nixon remained active behind the scenes. He advised presidents quietly. He hosted guests, wrote more books, and gave speeches. But he never returned to politics. He knew that door was closed. His legacy would always be complicated. Some admired his comeback. Others never forgave the crime. But Nixon never stopped trying to shape the narrative. He died in 1994, just months after his wife, Pat Nixon. His funeral was attended by every living president at the time. There were eulogies, there were tributes, but there was also silence. Watergate didn't go away when Nixon died. It simply became part of the history he could no longer rewrite. Even decades later, the lessons of Watergate haven't faded. The word itself became a suffix. Every political scandal since has been named something-gate. From small ethics violations to major cover-ups, Watergate set the frame. It changed how Americans think about truth, power, and accountability. It showed that even the president is not above the law, and it reminded future generations that institutions only work if people inside them choose to do what's right. Every major investigation into a sitting president, from Iran-Contra to Clinton's impeachment, from intelligence scandals to modern-day controversies, has been shaped by the Watergate roadmap. Subpoenas, hearings, court battles, public outrage. It's a cycle we now know well. And every time it starts again, Watergate gets mentioned. It remains the gold standard of political scandal. Not because it was the worst, but because it was the first to unfold in full view. The press still carries the burden of Watergate's legacy. Expectations are high, but so is distrust. The line between truth and spin has blurred in today's media landscape. But Watergate reminds us what's possible when reporters persist, when sources speak, when institutions don't fold. That legacy still inspires young journalists, legal scholars, and lawmakers. Cynicism lingers too. Watergate didn't just reveal a president's lies, it shook the foundation of belief in government. Today, many Americans still carry that skepticism. They don't just ask what happened, they ask who's hiding what. That's the echo Nixon left behind. A new kind of civic awareness, one built not on faith, but on proof. Watergate was a scandal, yes, but also a reckoning. And in that reckoning, democracy didn't collapse. It strained. It stumbled. But it stood. That, perhaps, is the final impact of Nixon's fall. Not that it broke the system, but that the system somehow held.